We all know Fire Emblem and war crimes go hand in hand, but how many war crimes does each Fire Emblem character commit? In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the exact war crimes of every Fire Emblem protagonist, from the first game in the series to Fire Emblem Engage. For the sake of avoiding repeats, I'm just going to ignore FE 1, 11, and 12 for the Arcanea games and just focus on 3, and I'll just focus on Shadows of Valentia and not bother with Gaiden. Having kept everything in a spreadsheet, we have a number of different categories which apply to the various Fire Emblem characters, but the first one, which applies to pretty much everyone, is child soldiers. Worth noting is that the cutoff is 15 years old, meaning that a lot of the children in Fire Emblem actually don't count. Luckily for us, there are still plenty of children under 15 throughout these games, so I'll go through them all, listing them in order from Fire Emblem 1 all the way through Fire Emblem 17. One last thing I do want to note is that I'm going to be counting the Manicheets. They may not be children, but they are absolutely children that should not be enlisted. I'm going to be assuming that you're recruiting all characters possible, but I'm not going to bother with the child units from Fire Emblem Awakening or Fates. Starting off strong, Marth has a solid tally at 6, including Ricard, Maria, Tiki, Ryan, Ubello, and Yulia. Sigurd only has 2 with Du and Sylvia, and Celise is a bit more complicated due to having replacement units. To make things easier, we'll just assume that everyone in Gen 1 was paired. That leaves us with Patty, Tine, Fee, and Charlotte. Leaf has 4 child units, including Sarah, Nana, Karen, and Miranda. For Roy, we have Lou, Ray, Chad, Kath, and Faye. For the FE7 Lords, everyone is guilty of having Nils on their team, but Lynn is exempt from having Nino. Ephraim and Erica enlist Ross, Amelia, Ewan, and Myrrh. In FE9, Ike enlists Rolf, Soth, and Tormod. In FE10, many of these characters have grown up, but the only one who still remains committing war crimes is Makaya in her recruitment of Sanaki. Awakening is Noe and Riken. Then in FE Fates we have Hayato, Sakura, and Elise. The only unit under 15 in Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia is Delphia in Alm's army, though she can technically be recruited by Celica through extenuous means. For the 3 Houses Lords, in order to make things clear, I've broken things up a bit. Byleth is going to encapsulate the war crimes for the Part 1, and then Edelgard, Claude, Dimitri, and Seth will represent the war crimes of each respective path in that game. Flame can be used on all routes but Edelgard's, and Cyril is still 14 at the beginning of the game, though after the time skip he is a legal soldier. Finally, we reach FE Engage, where we have Jean, Anna, and Hortensia, all under the age of 15. Conscripting child soldiers is the most common war crime amongst Fire Emblem characters, so from this point on we'll be getting into more niche war crimes. Our first topic up is compelling a prisoner of war into service. This one doesn't come up in most Fire Emblem games, but it does appear in Fire Emblem 5 Thracia 776. In this game there are 3 recruitments which require you to capture an enemy, and then they join you in the next chapter, which include Livis, Salem, and Misha. With that out of the way, we can move on to the next category, which is killing civilians and medics. Our first war criminal is Sigurd, having killed a single priest in the Siege of Herhain. His son, on the other hand, Celise, has killed a number of unarmed medics. He killed 2 priests in the Siege of Melgin, a Loptis bishop in Chapter 10, 2 troubadours in the Regale squad, 4 Chalfi priests, 2 priests in Melitus, 2 troubadours in Edda, 3 troubadours in Dozil, 3 in Zhongbi, and 3 high priests at Valhalla. Moving down the list, we have to go all the way to FE8 to find our next war crime, which is 1 troubadour killed in Scorched Sand. Ike killed 4 unarmed medics, 1 in 3.8, 2 in 4.4, and 1 in Rebirth 1. Micaiah killed a single priest in 1.8, and finally we have the Hawk army / Alencia's army who killed a single priest in 4.2. In both Birthright and Revelations, 2 healers were killed in the Ninja Village. With that all out of the way, I wanted to go over one additional situation which might count. Towards the end of FE10, Ashera's loyal subjects become the Order, and these are all people who were taken from Begnion, who are normal civilians, who were blessed by her. Due to their power, equipment, and organization, I'm not going to count this, but I could see why you would. Our next category up is another one exclusive to Thracia 776, that being using civilians in combat to force enemy action. Capture baiting enemies in Thracia is a very effective tactic, as it effectively halves all your enemies' attacks and forces them to not attack during that turn, so I'll be counting all the chapters which have civilian green units in them. That includes 6 civilians in Chapter 4, 6 in 4X, 3 in 11X, 6 in 14X, 8 in Chapter 18, 6 in Chapter 23, and 8 in Chapter 24. With that out of the way, we finally reach a new category which most Fire Emblem lords have partaken in. That being compelling soldiers to fight against their home country. In Mystery of the Emblem, Marth forces Wolf, Sedgar, Roshea, and Violen to fight against their home country. Sigurd has Lachesis against Lagustria and Teal'chu against Frege. In Gen 2, there's only Hannibal, who's forced to fight against Thracia. In FE5, Sias, Ilios, Olwyn, and Fred are forced to fight against their home countries. In FE6, we have Ellen, Gale, Melody, and Zeus. In the Sacred Stones, it's Natasha, Cormag, and Noel. FE9 has Tauronio, Har, Jill, and Zeark. Awakening has Tharia. Birthright has Silas, Jacob, and Felicia. Conquest has Kaze, Shura, and Mozu. In addition to this, however, all the Fates games have access to the capture mechanic in Prison in a different way than it is implemented in FE5. In Fates, all your prisoners are sent to a prison back in the Dream Realm, and you can conscript them by bribing them or torturing them, which is deeply unethical. Due to the fact that you can technically recruit a pseudo-infinite amount of enemies, it's difficult to put an exact number on this, so we're going to have to make our own metrics. Since the prison can hold up to 3 units in it, we'll just say that each route has 3 prisoners recruited. Moving on to 3 houses, in Part 1, Ash is sent against his home country and forced to fight his foster dad. Part 2 is a bit complicated in a similar vein to Fire Emblem Fates, since all the out-of-house characters can pretty much be recruited into any other house. I'm not going to list out every single character here, but just know that recruiting characters from out-of-house is a war crime. Our next category is the destruction and appropriation of enemy property. In Fire Emblem 4 Part 1, 17 enemy castles are taken in total and used by the army throughout their occupation of said countries. In Part 2, that number jumps to 24. In addition to this, your thieves are able to steal all gold on an enemy unit when they attack. This is also another thing that's pretty difficult to quantify, so we're just going to ignore it due to it, in most casual playthroughs, being pretty insignificant. FE5 allows you to capture enemies and take all their gear, forcefully trading it off of them before releasing them. This makes quantifying Leaf's war crimes very difficult since every playthrough is going to look very different. Because of that, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say that Leaf, on average, will steal 3 items per chapter. Now, this is obviously going to be very different depending on each individual chapter. There are some chapters where you're going to steal a lot of items, like in the Prison Break chapter, and there are some where you're not going to steal any, like in the Escape chapter. I think 3 is a pretty reasonable amount to keep it at. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. In all the Tellius games, thieves exist and can steal items off of enemies, but in addition to this, Ike's army in Chapter 3.3 burns enemy supplies. Similarly, in 3 Houses, items can also be stolen. There is an additional thing I did want to bring up though, which is that in Chapter 14 of Claude, Dimitri, and Seth's route, you set fire to a town. Our next war crime is declaring that no quarter will be given. I've decided that route maps pretty much fit this description. That said, I'll still be counting story elements where no quarter is declared. In FE5, Leaf specifically declares no quarter against Raedric. In Lynn's story, Chapter 1, 3, 5, 7X, and 8 are all route maps. For Eliwood, it's 12, 14, 22, 22X, 25, and 27. And for Hector, it's chapters 12, 14, 23, 23X, 27, and 29. For the Sacred Stones, there are a number of route maps that are specifically against zombies and other monsters, so I'm not going to be counting those. Still, there are chapters 2 and 15 on all routes, as well as chapter 9 on Erica route, and chapter 13 on Ephraim route. In FE9, we have chapters 2, 7, 12, 17, 1, 8, and 25. From Kaya's army, it's Part 1 Prologue, 1-4, 1-6-1, 1-8, 4 Prologue, and Chapter 4-3. For Ike, it's 3-1, 3-8, 3-10, 4-1, 4-4, and 4 Final 1. Finally, for FE10, we only have 1 route map for the Hawk army / Alentia's army, which is 4-2. In Awakening, the Prologue, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 15, and 23 are all route maps. Birthright has Chapter 7, 9, 10, 11, 13, 15, 16, 17, 22, and 23. Conquest is Chapter 7, 13, and 19, and Revelation has 11 and 14. In addition, for Conquest and Revelation, Perry is part of the army, meaning that she's probably committing a lot of crimes. Thing is, she isn't being commanded to do that, she's going out on her own, so we're not going to count it against them. In Shadows of Valencia, Alm has 8 route chapters in Act 1, 7 in Act 3, and 8 in Act 4. Celica has 7 in Act 2, 6 in Act 3, and 3 in Act 4. 3 Houses is a surprisingly low number of route maps, just Chapter 6 in Part 1. In all but Edelgard's route, there is Chapter 14. Surprisingly, Edelgard's route has no route maps, though you could count the extermination of those who slither in the dark in the postgame as a declaration of no quarter. Moving on to another niche category, which is surprisingly not held by Thracia this time, we have Perfidy. This is committed a single time by Claude's army in Chapter 18, where they disguise as Imperial troops. Continuing with the more niche categories, we'll go on to killing prisoners of war and depriving them of a trial. Thracia has 5 armor knights locked up in Chapter 20, who somehow get weapons, and you are forced to kill them. In Azure Moon, at the end of Chapter 14, Dimitri kills Randolph after he is surrendered. Finally, in Conquest, you can kill Shura for boots and absolutely will do so. This one is technically mutually exclusive with having Shura fight against his home country, so we'll only count one of the two against Conquest. Moving on for another niche category, we have using an attack knowing that it will cause incidental loss of life or damage to the environment. This is another category held exclusively by Fire Emblem Fates. In all routes in Chapter 6, you can use your Dragon Vein to dry up a river, which was a vital water source for the nearby towns. The rest take place in Revelations, the first one being in Chapter 14, where you can lower the water in a port town. Now, this would obviously have disastrous consequences on all the sailors and fishermen of the town. This also destroys the habitat of a number of animals in the water. Finally, in Revelation Chapter 22, you can burn down the woods, which I don't need to explain that. Our next category is attacking an enemy who has laid down arms. Since you can steal weapons in Fire Emblem 5 as well as the Tellius games, this could technically apply to a number of enemies. I think this lines up close enough with the appropriation of property that we're not going to have to bother counting it. That said, in Fire Emblem Fates, in Chapter 25 of Birthright, you can use a Dragon Vein to disarm enemies, which is not an ethical thing to do. That said, it is not a route map, so you don't technically have to kill anyone, so we're not going to bother counting it either. Our final category is using poisoned or biological weapons. Since magic exists in the Fire Emblem universe, there's more things that we have to consider here that the Geneva Convention didn't have to. Are Berserk Staffs an ethical use of magic? I don't think so. I'm not going to count specifically silence staves as biological weapons, but most other status staves will be counted. Marth exclusively has access to the silence staff, which means that we don't have to worry about him. In Fire Emblem 4, the sleep staff is available pretty early on, and the berserk staff is available in Part 2 if you didn't get a specific pairing. In Thracia, status staves are plentiful due to the fact that enemies can be captured. Additionally, dark magic inflicts poison on the enemy. This just means that Salem is a massive walking war crime. Again, it's difficult to quantify the number of war crimes committed in Thracia. For staves, we'll just say 1 per map, which accounts for the heavier usage in the end game and the lack of usage in the beginning of the game. In the GBA games, sleep staves and berserk staves exist. In the Tellius games, only sleep staves exist, but poison weapons can also be employed. Fates has a number of options, including freeze, enfeeble, and the hexing rod, which is deeply unethical and very frustrating. Shadows of Valentia exclusively has freeze, and Three Houses doesn't have any status staves, but there are poison weapons which can be forged. Finally, for engage, daggers inflict poison on the enemy, and the freeze staff exists. Daggers complicates things significantly, considering that they're pretty much one of the most optimal items to use in combat, and it's difficult to assess a game on how many times a certain item is used. We'll say that for the 20 chapters Unica is available, a dagger user is deployed on each map. I think that's fair considering how powerful daggers are. With all that brings us to the end of the war crimes tally. I will now list each of the Fire Emblem Lords, starting with the least war crimes and moving up to the most amount of war crimes committed. At the very bottom of our list, with only a single war crime, we have Valencia's army and the Hawk army. The next highest was 4 war crimes by Byleth during Part 1. I'm glad they don't rank any higher, because if my professor had 5 or more war crimes, I definitely would be concerned for my well-being. Lyn has the next least amount of war crimes with 6, followed by Micaiah with 9. Next up, we have a 3-way tie between Hector, Eliwood, and Marth with 10 war crimes each. Radiant Dawn Ike has an impressive 11 war crimes. Following him, we have a 3-way tie between Erica, Ephraim, and Robin. With 14 war crimes, we have Edelgard and Path of Radiance Ike. Now, it is worth noting that Path of Radiance Ike is a mercenary, meaning he is technically exempt from this. Continuing along, we have Conquest Corrin with 15 war crimes. Celica, Claude, and Setith each have 16, and Dimitri has 17 war crimes. Moving along, we have Birthright Corrin with 22. They are followed closely by Sigurd and Alir, who each have 23. Moving on to the top 3, in 3rd place we have Elm with 30 war crimes. This is pretty much just due to the density of route maps in his game. In 2nd, we have Celise with 52 war crimes. Celise kills a lot of medics throughout his journey, as well as takes control of way more castles than he probably needs. Finally, taking the number 1 spot with 151 war crimes, it is Leaf. With nearly 3 times the war crimes of his cousin, Leaf is unsurprisingly number one on this list, considering he's basically a terrorist and is just stealing and pillaging all he can from, to be fair, a pretty evil empire, but still. That all said, I want to thank you for watching this entire video. I was definitely surprised by some of these results. A lot of these controversial characters had way fewer war crimes than I would have expected. Now, I'm not 100% certain in the accuracy of all my assessments. I will leave the spreadsheet I used in the description below, but if I missed anything, please feel free to comment. That's all I have for you today, though. Thank you for watching.